The night he smashed my teacup, the house learned how to hold its breath. It was late November, the kind of cold that presses its face against the window and refuses to leave. The kitchen light was yellow and small. Rain walked down the panes in even little toes. I was standing at the sink with my hands soaked and wet, listening to the radio hum something I did not know the name of. The clock on the mantel read nearly midnight, but the house felt older than the hour. It felt older than me. I tell you that first because it matters where things begin. I am telling you from the same kitchen table, though the wood is scarred now from different lives. I am telling you as your grandmother, the one with the soft hands and the voice that forgets and remembers at odd times. I tell you so you will know I am not inventing drama for the sake of an audience. I am laying out pieces of a room where life happened, the smell of boiled coffee, the sticky patch on the table where peach jam had dried for a week, the slipper that someone left under the chair like a small confession. He came in quiet, but heavy. He had been out with other men, or that is what he said when his shoes hit the mat. His coat still had rain in it. He did not take it off. He only let it hang like a shadow and crossed the room in 2 steps. He stopped in front of the sink, where I had a plate stacked beside me, waiting for the next day to make sense of it. You left the radio on, he said. His voice was a small thing and sharp. You left it on to keep me from hearing. I remember my hands going cold. I remember thinking, absurdly, of the white cup on the shelf with blue flowers painted on it, the teacup Aunt June had given me when I was 21 and still believed people could change. He noticed my look. What are you looking at? He asked. I was just washing up, I said. My voice came out like a little cough. I had learned to be small because small was safer. I had learned to say less because less kept the house intact, sort of. He reached up and took the teacup from the shelf as if it were his right. He turned it in his hands and it chimed wetly. There was something in the way he smiled that night. It was a smile that had been rehearsed for years in rooms like this, in ways that make you believe fear without seeing it. You never listen, he said. You think you are in charge of the noises. Please, I said, because the word had been handy once for getting soup without complaint. Please put it back. It is old. He tapped it on the edge of the sink. I felt the sound cut across my ribs. You think a cup makes you whole? He asked. His face had gone small and pinched like the radio speaker. He smiled again and then his hand was like a hammer. The cup split in half. Porcelain spilled and glittered on the floor like rain. I remember the smell right after, not of rain but of hot tea and sharp dust. The pieces trembled, edges white and angry. Why did you keep it? He demanded. I kept it because Aunt June gave it to me, I said. It. He laughed, which is worse than any raised hand because laughter means your fear is amusing. He said, she was soft. You get soft because of other people. He said it like a law. I remember the radio still humming something. I remember how my knees wanted to go. I remember the way the light caught the broken blue flowers and I thought, for a second, that perhaps the world had finally decided to be honest. Stop, I said. Stop, please. Then Rachel, our eldest, came down the hallway. She was 15, the age where her whole face was still negotiating who she would become. She stood in the doorway with her hair half in a clip and half out, and she looked at us as if she had just walked into a stage set and could not understand the script. What is that noise? She asked. Her voice was thin with sleep and something that would later harden into a patient brand of survival. She stepped in and saw the cup. Her hand went to her mouth. He breaks things when he gets in, I said. Go back to bed, love. He turned to her, suddenly theatrical. You too are always listening. You think the house needs your plans. Rachel's face did not move. Dad, it's late. Please. He put his hand flat on the table and leaned in. I smelled him then, damp coat, aftershave, the faint, bitter edge of alcohol that had become a constant season in our home. "You both are so precious," he said, and there was a cruelty in the softness. "Enough," I said. The word came out of a place I did not know existed in me. It was small but steady. "Leave it alone. Go to the bedroom. Go now." He looked at me as if he was surprised at the sound of my voice, as if for a moment he had forgotten I had won. Then he moved toward Rachel like a cat who had decided to show his claws. She flinched, and that image is where I keep a photograph of what living scared looked like. He grabbed at her shoulder. It was not a hard pull, not what you see in films, but it was enough to bend her body and enough to make the kettle on the stove sing. "Do not touch her," I said. "You will not lay a hand on my child." He laughed then, and in that laugh I heard 1,000 old things. "Or what?" he said. "You will tell me again to leave. You think you can tell me anything?" "Yes," I said. "I will tell you. I will tell you until I have nothing left." Conversations like that are not tidy. They are not a paragraph in an essay. They are breath and hesitation and an ugly calculus of choices. I counted the ways I could protect Rachel. I thought of calling the police and then did not because of reasons you understand later, the threats, the shame, the worry about what the boys at work would say, the way your children might be split from you like dry bread. "Go to your room," I told Rachel, and I tried to make it sound like an order, but her eyes were full of questions. She stayed in the doorway and looked at me like she had never seen me so painted as brave. "Now," I said. She moved. She closed the door behind her with the slow sound of someone leaving a life in place. For a long moment I was alone with him and the broken blue flowers. He sat down at the table and wiped his hands on his trousers. "You always make it about them," he said. "You wear the crown of kindness and think it suits you." "Kindness is not a crown," I said. "It is a habit." "You never understand men," he said. "You never understood me." "You never let me," I answered. He drank from the bottle that had been on the counter. It was a small thing he did over the years, not to get drunk so much as to make the edges of himself fuzzy. Each sip seemed to smooth him perfect, in the way that violence is polished by denial. He looked at me then and for a moment I thought he might be sorry. For about 2 breaths, the world tilted back into the ordinary. He said, quietly, "I did not mean to break it." "I know," I said. That was not true, or not only true, but it was the answer that kept the room from cracking. I moved to the sink and rinsed the last of the tea down the drain. My hands shook but I kept washing. I always kept washing. Afterwards, later and later, we all slept in the same house but in rooms that were islands. Rachel slept with her door closed and the light on. I slept with one eye open, the old woman skill that the years teach you. I listened to the house breathe and tried to teach myself that there are nights that are accidents and nights that are patterns. That was our first lesson in patterns. It is strange telling you this now, because my hands are older, because the hair at my temple has gone the color of the winter sky and because I can fold the story in my mouth and roll it smooth. It is strange because I can see all of us in the doorway like cutouts, and I can imagine the little boy you were when your mother first showed you how to make a paper boat. It is strange because time softens some things and hardens others. When I say the house learned to hold its breath that night, I mean every creak learned to be polite. The kettle learned to whistle at lower pitches. Even the radio found a station that talked about weather and not feelings. We put the broken pieces in a bag and threw them in the garbage. We pretended the teacup's breaking had no meaning beyond the cup. But meaning is stubborn. It collects in corners like dust. It follows you when you sleep. Years later, Rachel would tell me she kept that sound in her head, the little chime of porcelain, the way a laugh can slice like a blade. She would tell me she learned to make herself small too, until she left one summer with nothing more than a suitcase and a coin in her pocket. She would tell me later that she remembers my hands on her arms that night, that there was a squeeze that said both love and warning, and that she took that squeeze and carried it like a compass. I am telling you this because beginnings matter, and because there are things I need you to know about how we learn to live with violence. I am telling you because I am tired of pretending the stories are tidy. I am telling you because you deserve the truth, even the parts that taste like broken tea. So this is the night I will keep until the rest of the nights make their own claims. The night the teacup broke. The night I decided, without knowing the whole of the map, that I would not let fear win us entirely. It was a small decision, a thin thing that would be tested many times. But every long story begins with a small decision. I want you to remember that. Listen. There is a sound from the back room. It is the same sound I heard then, only softer. It sounds like a clock trying to catch up. And that is where I need to stop for now, because the memory is a long river and I will not rush you through its bends. The next morning arrived like it always did, too early and too bright for what the night had taken from us. Sunlight sneaked through the blinds in stubborn lines, painting stripes across the floor like someone had drawn them with a ruler. I stayed in bed longer than usual, listening to the house stir. Rachel had left her door open a crack, letting the sound of her breathing filter through. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the stairwell. Small things, ordinary things, and yet heavy with the residue of last night. When I finally got up, I padded to the kitchen, feet cold on the wooden floor. The broken teacup had been swept away, but the memory of it clung to the walls. He was already there, drinking black coffee like it had the power to make him less. I tried to look away from the shadow he cast on the linoleum, but something in me, a stubborn piece that had survived long nights like this, kept my eyes on him. You didn't sleep well, he said, without looking up. I poured myself a cup of weak tea, more for ritual than for warmth. Neither did you, I said. The words felt thin. I was careful with them, wrapping them in politeness like bandages over bruises. He snorted, a sound meant to dismiss, but it only drew attention to the tension in his shoulders. I'll leave when I'm ready, he said. I know, I replied. It was a small acknowledgement, but one that cost me. I could feel the weight of the words like a ledger, marking each interaction we had ever had, each silence we'd shared, each scream that had never left the walls. Rachel came down then, barefoot and brushing her hair. She did not say good morning. Instead, she took the seat opposite me, eyes still red, still calculating. She had learned quickly that the best defense was vigilance. Is he gone yet? She asked softly, not wanting to wake him if he was pretending to sleep. He's here, I said, my voice low. Just be careful. She nodded, which was her way of saying I understood, and we drank in silence, letting the sunlight stretch across our table and not fill in the spaces where safety should have been. Later that day, he left for work, or at least, he left the house. The door clicked behind him, and the echo seemed almost like a sigh. I followed Rachel upstairs, and we collapsed onto the edge of her bed like two figures in a painting that had been waiting for light. Do you think it will get better? She asked, and I saw in her face the combination of hope and dread that comes with watching a storm pass through your home and never leave entirely. I didn't answer immediately. I traced the edge of the quilt with my fingers, feeling the stitching, the uneven thread that reminded me of all the repairs I had ever made, not just to blankets, but to hearts and lives. I don't know, I said finally. Sometimes, it does. Sometimes, storms teach you where to hide, not how to stop raining. She frowned. I hate hiding. And I hate knowing you have to, I said. But sometimes surviving means bending, not breaking. The conversation faded as the afternoon light moved across the walls. I tried to keep the house quiet, to keep the echoes of last night from stretching into every corner. But you cannot erase sound once it has been made. You only learn to live with it. That evening, he returned, bringing with him the smell of wet streets and cigarettes and that bitter, heavy edge of anger he could not quite leave outside. The moment he stepped through the door, the air shifted. I could feel it like static, and my stomach curled in anticipation of what shape the night would take. "Tea," he said, not as a question, but as an expectation. I poured him a cup and set it on the table. His eyes lingered on it, but he did not touch it. "You think tea fixes things?" he asked. "It fixes nothing," I said. "But sometimes, offering it reminds you that someone cares." He didn't respond. He only turned and left the kitchen, slamming the door behind him just enough to make the walls vibrate. Rachel, sitting across from me, flinched, and I reached across and held her hand. It was a small comfort, a reminder that even in these moments of chaos, connections still existed. Later that night, after the lights were out and the house had settled into the rhythm of quiet breathing, I sat in the darkened kitchen with a notebook. I wrote down memories I thought I had buried, the first time he raised his hand, the nights I stayed awake listening to his footsteps, the afternoons Rachel spent at the library to escape the tension. Writing was like peeling skin, painful, necessary, revealing. I reflected on the choices I had made. How many times had I tried to believe in his good intentions, only to be met with disappointment? How many times had I smiled to protect the children, to protect myself? I thought of my mother and how she had endured things silently, teaching me that endurance was a family trait. But I realized then that endurance without action is just waiting. And I was tired of waiting. The sound of his boots on the porch startled me. I pressed my hand to the table and felt the tremor run through my arm. He was quiet now, more patient perhaps, but danger had a way of hiding behind patience. I listened to him move through the house, trying to imagine the thoughts behind the mask he wore so well. I wondered about the life I might have had if I had left earlier, if I had trusted my instincts more. But regret was a luxury I could not afford. Instead, I focused on the small victories, keeping Rachel safe, teaching her resilience, showing her that kindness could survive even in the shadows. The next morning, Rachel and I shared a breakfast of toast and tea. We spoke softly, as if our words might shatter like porcelain if spoken too loudly. I told her stories from my own childhood, moments of joy hidden among hardships, so she would understand that life was not only pain. "You are strong," I said, reaching across the table to touch her hand. "Stronger than you know." She smiled faintly, and in that smile, I saw the glimmer of a future not yet touched by fear. It was a fragile thing, but precious. That day, I made a decision. I would not let the pattern continue. I would seek help, find allies, gather knowledge about what steps could be taken to protect us. It was terrifying, but necessary. The world outside might not understand our home, but I owed it to Rachel, and to myself, to try. Even as I prepared for the difficult conversations ahead, I paused to notice the ordinary details, the way the sunlight hit the sink in the morning, the aroma of tea leaves steeping, the softness of the quilt under Rachel's fingertips. These small things grounded me, reminded me that life could still be beautiful even when it was complicated and dangerous. That night, as we lay in our separate beds, I felt a strange sense of resolve. The fear was still there, thick and insistent, but so was determination. I whispered a promise to myself and to Rachel: we would survive. We would find a way. And perhaps, in time, we would thrive. The house remained silent, holding its breath like it had the night the teacup broke. And in that silence, I could feel the beginnings of change, a subtle shift that suggested hope might be possible after all. We were not free yet. But for the first time in a long time, I believed we could be. The next few weeks felt like walking on ice over water I could not see. The air in the house was heavy with expectation, each footstep measured, each word considered. Rachel and I moved through our routines carefully, aware of the invisible cracks that had begun to form. I tried to focus on small, ordinary things: baking bread, washing the dishes, tending the little plants on the windowsill, but even those moments were tinged with the memory of broken porcelain and the sharpness of his gaze. One afternoon, I was in the living room, mending a tear in Rachel's school jumper, when he returned early from work. The front door opened with a suddenness that made me jump. His boots clattered across the floor and he stopped in the hallway, his shadow falling long across the rug. There was a weight in his movement, something deliberate, something waiting to unsettle the air. I kept my head down, working the needle carefully through the fabric. "You're home early," I said softly, hoping my voice sounded neutral. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood there, arms crossed, watching. I could smell the dampness of his coat, the faint scent of alcohol still clinging to him. "Did you talk to anyone?" he finally asked, and I knew exactly what he meant. His eyes were sharp, scanning me, trying to find the evidence of a plan I had not yet fully formed. "No," I said, my voice steady. "I've been busy. Keeping up with the house, the children, things like that." He took a step closer, and I felt the heat of his presence pressing into the small living room. "You think you can protect her from me?" His voice was low, but there was menace in it. "From me and from what I do when I'm angry?" "I don't know," I admitted, the truth slipping out like a frightened bird. "But I will try. Always." Rachel appeared at the doorway, clutching her books to her chest. Her eyes were wide, her body tense. "Mom," she said quietly, "what's happening?" I motioned for her to sit on the couch, trying to shield her with my body. "Nothing yet, love," I said. "Just talk." But my words were hollow. I could see the fear mirrored in her gaze, the same fear I had tried to bury, the same fear that had followed me for decades. He laughed, and it was a cold, sharp sound that made the air in the room tighten. "You both think you can hide from me, think you can plan behind my back." He stepped closer, and I felt the tension coil in my chest. "Do you know what happens to people who plan without telling me?" I swallowed hard, keeping my hands busy with the fabric. "I don't want anyone hurt," I said. "I just want peace in this house." He snorted, shaking his head. "Peace? You don't get peace. You get obedience. You get fear. That's the lesson." Rachel's lips trembled, and I reached for her hand under the jumper. I could feel her small, cold fingers curl around mine. My heart ached with the weight of responsibility. I had spent so many years trying to protect, to soften, to endure. But now, I realized, protecting sometimes meant confronting, not retreating. Suddenly, he turned sharply, moving to the kitchen counter. His hand slammed down on the surface, rattling the utensils in the drawer. "Do you understand what it means to be powerless?" he demanded, voice rising. "Do you know what it feels like to have your life, your children, your home, in someone else's control?" I froze, feeling the familiar panic rise, but I forced myself to breathe. I had survived this before. I could survive it again. "Yes," I said softly, "I know." And then he did something unexpected. He laughed again, softer this time, and stepped back. "You do," he said. "And that makes it worse. You know, and you still try to challenge me." I didn't respond. My thoughts were racing. I had always believed that knowledge was power, but now I understood the danger in knowing too much. It could provoke him, push him into places I could not predict. Yet, I also realized that pretending ignorance was no longer safe either. Rachel squeezed my hand, and I whispered, "I have a plan. I promise you." She nodded, trusting me in the way children trust someone who has always been their anchor. That night, I stayed awake long after the lights went out. I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker through the rain-soaked trees. My mind traced the years of patterns, the small betrayals, the nights of whispered threats, the days of forced smiles. And then it struck me, there were cracks in him too, moments where his control faltered. Moments that, if used carefully, could give us an opening. It was risky, terrifying even, but I began to map a path. Small steps, measured actions. Allies outside the house. Contacts I could make quietly. The kind of planning that required patience and nerve. I had survived worse. Rachel had survived worse. And perhaps, finally, the right moment could shift everything. The next day, I acted as if nothing had changed. I prepared breakfast with deliberate normalcy, smiled at Rachel, and pretended to ignore the unease that thrummed in the air. But beneath the surface, the currents were moving. I contacted a counselor I had met through the school, someone discreet and experienced. I left subtle messages with neighbors, people I trusted. Each action was small, almost imperceptible, but it was progress. And then came the twist I had not anticipated. One evening, while clearing the kitchen after dinner, I found a letter slipped under the door. The envelope was unmarked, but the handwriting was familiar. My hands shook as I opened it, and inside was a photograph of Rachel, taken from a distance, one of the first times she had walked to school alone. I recognized the man's handwriting on the back, a warning. He had been watching more closely than I realized. Fear settled in my chest like ice. But alongside it was determination. This was the reality we faced. This was the proof that action could not be postponed. I showed Rachel the letter, and we sat together in silence, the photograph between us, understanding that the world we lived in demanded vigilance, courage, and, sometimes, deception. That night, I whispered to her, "We are not powerless. We will find a way." And she nodded, eyes bright with the fragile flame of hope. The days that followed were tense, a delicate dance of normalcy and preparation. I taught Rachel subtle ways to be aware, small techniques to stay safe, ways to signal distress without words. Each night, I wrote in my notebook, chronicling our lives, our fears, and our plans. Writing became both a tool and a shield, a way to process what we endured and to prepare for what was coming. And yet, despite the fear, there were moments of tenderness. I would catch Rachel laughing quietly at something she had read, or humming a tune she liked. In those moments, I remembered why survival mattered, why the smallest victories, like a smile, a shared joke, a quiet morning, could carry us through the darkest times. By the end of the week, the tension in the house had reached a peak, almost tangible, like static before a storm. I knew that soon, everything would change. The patterns we had lived with for years were shifting, and we would have to be ready. I could not predict the exact moment, but I could feel it coming. The storm, the confrontation, the moment where fear would meet courage. And so I waited, as I always had, but with a new resolve. The teacup had shattered months ago, but its memory was a reminder, even the smallest pieces could leave a mark, even a tiny crack could let in light. We were waiting for that light. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of day that feels ordinary until it is not. I was folding laundry in the living room, the scent of fabric softener mixing with the faint tang of rain from the open window. Rachel was at her desk, homework spread before her, the soft scratch of pencil on paper filling the room. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that the world had given us a reprieve. I allowed myself to believe that we could breathe without calculating every movement. Then the doorbell rang. It was a sharp, insistent sound that cut through the quiet like a knife. My heart tightened. Visitors were rare, and at this hour, rarer still. I put down the laundry, smoothing the wrinkles in my palms, and moved to the door. Through the peephole, I saw a young man in a plain jacket, carrying a small package. There was nothing remarkable about him, and yet, something about the way he stood, too still, too aware, made my stomach knot. I opened the door cautiously. "Delivery for," he began. "It's for me," I said quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. He handed me the package without another word and turned on his heel. I closed the door and locked it immediately, my hands trembling. Rachel had come up behind me, eyes wide. "Grandma," she whispered. "Who was that?" "I don't know," I admitted, though the truth was heavier than words. I carried the package to the table and placed it down. The weight of it seemed to hum in the air, like a warning I couldn't yet interpret. I tore the wrapping carefully. Inside was a small box, black and unmarked. I opened it, and inside was a stack of photographs, dozens of them, each one capturing moments of Rachel, of me, of the house. Photos taken from angles that suggested someone had been watching us for weeks, maybe months. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands shook as I flipped through them, the images documenting ordinary life with an ordinary cruelty that made my stomach twist. There we were, laughing in the kitchen, Rachel reading on the sofa, me planting flowers on the windowsill, everyday moments turned into evidence of surveillance. Rachel gasped, covering her mouth. "Grandma." "I know," I said, my voice low, almost a whisper. "I know what this is." We sat together at the table, the photographs spread before us like a dark puzzle. I traced the edges with my fingers, remembering each day they captured, realizing that our lives had been observed without our knowledge. The fear was immediate, but so was clarity. Whoever had sent these photos wanted to intimidate us. Whoever it was knew our patterns, our routines, our vulnerabilities. My thoughts went immediately to him. To the man who had held our home in a shadow for years. The realization hit me like cold water. He had escalated, and the escalation meant we could no longer delay action. I gathered Rachel close. "We cannot wait anymore," I whispered. "We have to be smart. We have to be ready." The night that followed was sleepless. I mapped out every exit, every possible source of warning, every ally who could help us. I called the counselor I had contacted before, explained the photographs, and arranged a discreet meeting for the next day. Each plan, each precaution, brought a measure of relief, but the weight of danger never lifted entirely. The next morning, I walked Rachel to school myself. The sky was grey and low, and the damp air pressed against our faces. I held her hand tightly, aware that each step we took was a small act of defiance. We did not speak much. Words were unnecessary. Fear was present, but so was resolve. When we returned, the house was silent, almost unnervingly so. I moved cautiously, checking each room, each hallway, for any sign of intrusion. Everything seemed normal, but the photographs remained in my mind, a reminder that we were being watched, that the walls we had relied upon for protection were not impenetrable. And then, I found it, a note, slipped under the kitchen door. My hands were already trembling from the photographs, and this note made them shake harder. The handwriting was unmistakable, his. "I see you planning," it read. "I see you thinking you can escape. You will not." The words cut deeper than any blow, sharper than any hand. I sat down at the table, clutching the note, feeling the weight of years of fear pressing down, and I realized that the man we had lived with was not merely abusive in the physical sense, he was calculating, relentless, and unyielding. But in that moment, I also realized something crucial. He had underestimated us. He had not accounted for the quiet determination that had been growing in me, for the intelligence and courage that Rachel had inherited. The fear was real, yes, but so was our capacity to fight back, to survive, to reclaim our lives. That afternoon, I made calls. I spoke to the counselor, to a legal advisor, to neighbors who could act as witnesses. Every conversation was a small step, a subtle shift toward safety. I instructed Rachel on ways to be vigilant, on what to watch for, and how to signal if something was wrong. Even as we prepared, moments of tenderness persisted. Rachel and I shared tea, worked on homework together, and laughed softly at the smallest jokes. These moments were not naive, they were deliberate acts of reclaiming our lives, reminders that fear could coexist with hope. That night, he returned, and I felt the familiar tension coil in my chest. But this time, I was ready. I met him in the living room, photographs and notes hidden, a calm I had not felt in years settling into my bones. He looked at me, searching for signs of weakness, for hesitation. "You've been busy," he said, voice low, almost dangerous. Yes, I replied, steady. I've been planning. Planning for our safety. Planning for the children. His eyes narrowed. And you think that gives you power over me? No, I said. It gives me power over my own fear. And that is enough. He laughed, a low, harsh sound that bounced off the walls. You've changed, he said. You are no longer soft. I've learned, I replied. I've learned that survival requires courage. And sometimes, it requires action. For a moment, he studied me, as if trying to understand the transformation he had failed to anticipate. And then he left the room, silently, without another word. I knew the path ahead would not be easy. The photographs, the notes, the constant watchfulness, all of it was a reminder that we were in a dangerous game. But for the first time, I also knew that we had a chance. The pieces were in place. We were ready to act, to reclaim our lives, and to protect Rachel in ways that fear alone could not ensure. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the house breathe, I allowed myself a small measure of hope. We had survived countless nights like this. We had endured more than anyone should. And now, armed with knowledge, strategy, and courage, we were ready to face whatever came next. The storm had not passed, but the wind had shifted. And sometimes, a shift in the wind is enough to carry you toward safety. The house never truly sleeps. Even when the doors are closed and the lights are off, it hums with memory, the creaks of footsteps that were never meant to be heard, the whisper of voices long silenced. That night, I lay awake, listening to the rhythm of the walls, the faint scratching of a mouse in the corner, and the slow, steady breathing of Rachel in the next room. But beneath all of it, I could hear something else, the pulse of inevitability. The storm was coming, and we could no longer avoid it. The next morning, I moved through the house with deliberate calm, as though the ordinary acts of breakfast, laundry, and tidying could mask the tension that hummed just beneath the surface. Rachel sat at the kitchen table, her pencil poised over homework, her eyes bright with alertness. She did not ask questions. She had learned that questions were dangerous, silence, careful and measured, was safer. When he returned from work, the air thickened immediately. He did not speak at first, merely leaned against the doorway, his arms folded, scanning the room like a predator sizing up prey. I could smell the dampness in his coat, the faint bite of alcohol lingering from the evening before, and the familiar, suffocating scent of control. You've been busy, he said finally, voice low and dangerous. Planning, organizing, thinking you can get ahead of me. I've been preparing, I said evenly, keeping my hands occupied with the teapot, pouring water, pretending it was just another ordinary day. Preparing for what's best for the children. He laughed, and it was a low, mocking sound that made the hairs on my arms rise. Children, he said. You mean your little schemes, trying to make them think they can escape reality? I set down the kettle, looking him straight in the eyes. I'm teaching them survival. Something you never understood. His face twisted, and for a moment, I saw the mask of control slip. His hand struck the table, rattling the cups, the teaspoons, the small glass of milk Rachel had left for her breakfast. You dare, he whispered, voice shaking with restrained rage. You dare teach them what I won't allow. I swallowed the fear that clawed at my throat. Years of living in his shadow had taught me how to steady myself when panic wanted to take over. I reached out and placed a hand over Rachel's, guiding her quietly to the floor beside me. We survive together, I said softly. We protect each other. For a long moment, he just glared, pacing slowly. The air was tight, electric, filled with all the words we hadn't spoken, all the nights of silence, all the moments of control and fear and intimidation. Then, suddenly, he moved toward the living room chair where he often sat, as if deciding this confrontation would be momentary, not permanent. You think you've won, he said. That you can outsmart me? You don't understand what I can do. We understand enough, I said. We understand that fear alone doesn't protect anyone. Action does. At that, he froze, as though the words had landed more firmly than any blow. There was a pause that stretched long enough for me to feel the weight of every year, every threat, every sleepless night pressing against me. And then he laughed, but it was hollow this time, echoing off the walls in a way that seemed to fracture the control he usually wielded so effortlessly. Rachel's eyes were wide, bright and terrified, yet also something else, a spark of hope that had been carefully nurtured in the months since the photographs arrived. I whispered to her, "Remember, stay calm. Trust me." She nodded, her small hand gripping mine with quiet ferocity. I could feel the shift. The tension was a living thing, coiling and uncoiling, waiting for someone to strike. He moved suddenly, grabbing at the air, gesturing wildly, and I realized that his control was slipping, not completely, but enough. Enough for us to see that the power he had wielded for years was not infinite. I took a slow breath. "This ends tonight," I said, my voice steady. "We either live in fear, or we take the steps to survive. It's our choice." He laughed again, short and sharp, but the laughter did not fill the room. It trembled on the edges, betraying cracks in the armor he had built around himself. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of possibilities. For the first time, I understood that even he was vulnerable, even he could be outmaneuvered. The night stretched ahead, long and fraught with possibilities. I moved through the house quietly, checking locks, preparing signals, placing phones and important documents in bags that could be grabbed at a moment's notice. Rachel followed my lead, silent but attentive, absorbing every detail, every instruction. As darkness fell, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. From the first shattered teacup to the photographs under the door, each event had taught us resilience, patience, and cunning. Every fear had been a teacher, every threat, a lesson. And now, we were ready to confront the culmination of years of oppression, to meet him with courage instead of trembling. By midnight, the house was still except for the soft breathing of Rachel and the faint ticking of the clock. I listened to the familiar sounds, each one magnified in the silence. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain, a reminder that the world continued beyond the walls that had confined us for so long. And then he moved through the hallway, a shadow among shadows, unaware that the night had already been claimed. I was ready. Rachel was ready. The storm had arrived, and for the first time, I felt the strange thrill of confrontation, fear and determination intertwined, sharp and bright. We would no longer be passive observers in our own lives. The house that had learned to hold its breath would bear witness to our courage, our strategy, our refusal to be broken. The night was ours to reclaim, and I would not fail. This was the moment where years of quiet endurance, subtle planning, and emotional fortitude converged. The confrontation we had anticipated for so long was finally at hand, and in its shadow, I felt the weight of all my past decisions, both mistakes and triumphs, settling into a strange, resolute clarity. We were ready to act. The night stretched long and taut, each shadow in the house like a finger pointing toward inevitability. I sat in the living room, Rachel close by, our hands intertwined, listening. Every footstep he took, every creak in the floorboards, was a note in a symphony I had rehearsed in my mind for weeks. This was it, the moment where fear met preparation, where survival demanded courage. He entered the room as quietly as he could, but I knew the rhythm of his movement. His eyes flicked over us, sharp, searching for any sign of weakness. "You're ready," he said, almost a statement, almost a challenge. "I've never been more ready," I replied, voice calm, even. I could feel Rachel's grip on my hand tighten. She was ready too, though I knew she carried years of fear beneath her courage. He laughed, a sound that had haunted our nights for too long. "You think this changes anything? You think you can take control?" "No," I said. "But we can take our lives back." For a moment, He stared, as if trying to calculate every possible outcome. Then he lunged, not wildly, but with intent, the kind of motion practiced and precise, meant to intimidate. I didn't flinch. I stepped aside, guiding Rachel behind me, keeping her out of his reach. The years of teaching, of warning, of planning, all coalesced into instinct. "You cannot do this," he shouted, voice cracking, the mask of control slipping. "You do not understand what you're facing." "I understand enough," I said. "I understand that fear alone does not protect us. Knowledge, preparation, and courage do." Rachel watched, wide-eyed but steady, as I spoke. Her presence anchored me, reminded me of why I had endured, why I had planned, why I had risked so much. She was not just my daughter in this moment, she was a reminder that the next generation deserved safety, dignity, and hope. He advanced again, and I acted quickly. I grabbed my phone from the counter, already dialed to the counselor and the authorities, my fingers trembling but precise. The moment he realized, his anger shifted into disbelief. "You would call them," he spat. "After everything." "After everything," I said. "Because enough is enough." The tension broke like a storm released. He backed away, muttering threats that no longer carried weight. In that moment, his power, so long absolute in our home, fractured. He was not invincible. He was simply a man, and we were no longer children to be cowered into silence. Rachel and I stayed close, keeping watch as I spoke quietly to the authorities, confirming their arrival, explaining our location, the history, the danger. Each word was deliberate, a shield against the chaos of years. When he realized he could not maintain control, he tried to retreat, slamming doors, kicking objects, screaming. But we were prepared. Our escape routes were clear, neighbors alerted, the house mapped in ways he could not predict. Each act of aggression was countered with calm strategy, each attempt to intimidate met with preparedness and resolve. By the time the police arrived, he was contained, bewildered, the force of his own rage neutralized by our meticulous planning. I stood in the hallway, Rachel beside me, watching him taken away, and I felt a strange combination of relief, exhaustion, and the bitter taste of years spent surviving in fear. It was over, in the immediate sense, but I knew the aftermath would linger. Trauma does not vanish with a door slamming or a handcuff clicking. It leaves marks, memories, and lessons that take years to fully integrate. But in that moment, I allowed myself to breathe, to feel the house exhale after holding its breath for decades. Rachel turned to me, eyes wide with a mixture of awe and relief. "Grandma," she whispered. "We did it," I said softly, squeezing her hand. "We survived. We took back what was ours." The nights that followed were not perfect, but they were ours. Sleep returned gradually, and ordinary routines slowly reclaimed their place. I spent hours with Rachel, talking about the fear we had endured, the lessons we had learned, the ways to heal. She laughed again, a sound that had been rare, a sound that felt like sunlight through storm clouds. I reflected on the journey, the teacup that had shattered, the photographs under the door, the constant tension that had defined our days and nights. Each moment had been a step toward this one, a preparation for courage, a rehearsal for survival. I realized that the small decisions, the tiny acts of defiance, the careful planning, had accumulated into a force that even the most controlling could not withstand. I also understood the legacy I wanted to leave. Not a life defined by fear, but a life defined by resilience, intelligence, and love. I wanted Rachel to know that courage does not always roar, sometimes it whispers, it plans, it waits for the right moment to act. Survival is not just enduring, it is learning, teaching, and reclaiming your life when the world has tried to take it from you. In the quiet mornings, as we drank tea together and watched sunlight streak across the floorboards, I began to feel something I had not felt in years: peace. Not complete peace, because life always carries its shadows, but peace in knowing that fear had been met with action, and that action had saved us. I wrote in my notebook again, chronicling the events, the emotions, the victories. Writing had become a way to process, to understand, and to preserve the lessons learned. I wrote not just for myself, but for Rachel, for the generations to come, for anyone who might need to understand that survival is possible, even in the darkest of circumstances. Looking back, I realized the story of our lives was never just about fear or pain. It was about endurance, strategy, and love, the love that compelled me to act, the love that guided Rachel, the love that survived even when everything else seemed lost. And though the house still held echoes of the past, it now held something new, hope, strength, and the knowledge that we could face whatever came next. The storm had arrived, and we had not only weathered it, we had reclaimed the sky afterward. The days that followed were quieter, but not simple. Silence hung differently in the house now, more like a curtain drawn carefully rather than a weight pressing down. Rachel and I moved through our routines deliberately, aware of how fragile safety could feel even after fear had left the room. There were moments when I found myself holding my breath out of habit, expecting danger that no longer existed. It was strange, this new world of cautious calm. Rachel started school again, walking with a small group of friends and waving to neighbors we trusted. Each step she took was both ordinary and monumental, a reclaiming of space that had been denied to her for years. I watched from the window, heart tight with a mix of pride and lingering anxiety. Even as the authorities handled the legal side of our ordeal, I knew that true safety was a process, not a single act. One morning, I found her in the kitchen, quietly making breakfast for us both. The movement was careful, practiced, but it was hers. "Grandma," she said softly, "I feel lighter." I smiled, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "You should. You've earned it." She laughed faintly, the kind of laugh that carries both relief and disbelief. "It feels strange to not be scared all the time," she admitted. "Yes," I said. "But that's part of learning to live again. Fear teaches us, but it doesn't have to rule us forever." We began to fill the house with small rituals, ordinary acts that had been impossible when tension ruled. Baking bread on Saturday mornings, watering plants, listening to music together, reading aloud in the evenings. Each moment was a stitch in a new fabric of our lives, a tapestry woven from patience, courage, and the knowledge that even ordinary days could carry profound significance. Yet, even in this calm, there were echoes of the past. Some nights, I would wake to the sound of the wind rattling the window panes and feel a jolt of old anxiety. Sometimes, Rachel would startle at an unexpected noise, her hand finding mine for reassurance. And I would hold her, feeling both the weight of memory and the strength of our survival. I began speaking with a counselor regularly, processing the years of trauma and learning how to navigate a world that had once felt unpredictable and dangerous. We spoke about boundaries, trust, and the ways to reclaim agency over our own lives. With each conversation, I felt a little more whole, a little more equipped to guide Rachel through her own journey of healing. Rachel, too, began to open up about her feelings, her fears, and the dreams that had been quietly growing despite everything. She wrote in a journal, sharing thoughts she had once been too afraid to voice. I read her entries when she offered them, marveling at the resilience and insight of a child who had lived through too much and yet refused to be defined by it. We also took steps to make our lives more secure. Locks were checked, routines adjusted, safety plans reviewed, and neighbors involved when appropriate. Each action was both practical and symbolic, a declaration that we would no longer live under the shadow of fear. One evening, I sat on the porch with Rachel, watching the sun set over the quiet street. The sky was painted with orange and pink, a reminder that beauty could coexist with struggle. She leaned against me and said, "I never thought we'd get here." "No," I said, my voice soft but firm. "But we did. And we will continue to." I thought about all the nights we had spent enduring, planning, fearing, and surviving. I thought about the teacup, the photographs, the threats, and the small victories that had led us here. I realized that survival was not just about escaping danger, it was about reclaiming life, teaching resilience, and building a legacy of courage for the next generation. In that moment, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the small things, for Rachel's courage, for the neighbors and professionals who had helped, and for the inner strength that had carried us through. We had been tested, and though the scars remained, we had emerged stronger, more connected, and more aware of the value of our own agency. Later, as the night deepened, I reflected on the lessons of these years. Life could be brutal and unfair, filled with people who sought to control or harm. But it could also be beautiful, filled with acts of love, moments of courage, and the power to reclaim one's own story. I resolved to hold on to these lessons and to share them, so that fear would never again be mistaken for inevitability. I began chronicling our experiences in a journal, not just as a record of survival but as a guide for Rachel, and perhaps, one day, for others. I wrote about the signs of danger, the strategies of preparation, and the importance of trusting one's instincts. I wrote about courage, not the kind that comes from anger or confrontation, but the quiet, persistent kind that allows a person to endure, plan, and protect those they love. Rachel and I also spent time reconnecting with extended family and friends. We allowed ourselves to be seen in our vulnerability and strength, to rebuild relationships that had frayed under the weight of fear. These connections became another layer of protection, a reminder that we were not alone and that community could be a force of resilience and healing. Through it all, I carried a deep awareness of the fragility and strength of life. We had endured trauma, yes, but we had also endured love, hope, and determination. And in that endurance, I saw the possibility of transformation, not just for ourselves, but for the way we engaged with the world, for the values we instilled in Rachel, and for the legacy we would leave behind. As the weeks turned into months, the house began to feel like a home again, not perfect, not free from all fear, but a place where safety, care, and resilience were cultivated daily. We were learning, slowly and deliberately, to trust again, to laugh again, and to believe in the possibility of ordinary joy. One evening, I found Rachel sitting at the window, watching the stars emerge. "Grandma," she said softly, "I think I'm starting to feel like myself again." "You are," I said, smiling. "And you always will be, because you've learned how strong you are." We sat together in silence, letting the quiet stretch between us like a bridge connecting past and future. I felt the weight of history, of trauma, but also the lightness of survival and the power of love that had guided us through. And in that quiet moment, I realized that our story, our full, messy, painful, and ultimately hopeful story, was not only about what we had endured but about what we had become, survivors, teachers, and witnesses to the strength that can emerge from the darkest nights. The seasons shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly, in the weeks and months that followed. The rain softened into steady spring showers, and the sun lingered longer each evening, casting gold across the living room where Rachel and I shared quiet afternoons. Life had returned to a rhythm, not ordinary in the way it had been before, but ordinary in a sense that felt earned, reclaimed, and profoundly fragile. I watched Rachel grow more confident with each passing day. She walked to school without hesitation, laughed freely with friends, and began speaking about her future as though the past had not weighed her down entirely. Each small step she took was a triumph, a testament to the resilience she carried inside her. And every time I saw her smile without fear, I felt a pang of relief that mixed with pride, a complicated, beautiful emotion that only a survivor understands. Some nights, we sat on the porch together, sharing tea and looking at the sky. She would point out constellations and ask questions about planets and stars, her curiosity boundless and unburdened by the shadows that had once filled our home. I answered patiently, telling stories about the heavens, about our ancestors, about the lessons we had learned from surviving storms both literal and emotional. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned a soft violet, Rachel leaned her head against my shoulder. Grandma, she whispered, do you think we're really free now? I hugged her close, feeling the small rise and fall of her chest, the warmth of her hand against mine. We are free, I said softly, not because the past is gone, but because we've learned how to live despite it. Freedom isn't about forgetting, it's about choosing courage over fear, every day. We talked then about the years we had endured, the threats, the silences, the careful calculations, and the nights of listening for danger. I told her stories she had not heard before, about my own childhood and the women in my family who had survived hardship. I wanted her to understand that resilience was not a single act, but a tapestry of decisions, reflections, and love. That courage could coexist with fear, and that healing did not mean perfection, it meant endurance, compassion, and careful attention to the life we wanted to build. I wrote in my journal every night, chronicling not just the events, but the emotions, the reflections, the lessons. I wanted Rachel to have a guide, something tangible to carry forward when I was no longer there. Not a story of fear, but a story of survival, strategy, and love. Not a story of what was lost, but a story of what could be reclaimed. Some days, I still felt the shadows of memory, sudden pangs of anxiety, the muscle memory of flinching at small noises, but those moments were fleeting. They no longer ruled us. We had reclaimed our home, our lives, and our agency. And with each day, the space between fear and courage widened, filled with ordinary joys, laughter, and shared understanding. I thought often about the journey that had brought us here, from shattered teacups to photographs slipped under the door, from whispered threats to strategic plans, from despair to the first tentative steps toward freedom. Each moment, even the painful ones, had built the foundation for this fragile, luminous present. I realized that the story was never just about surviving abuse, it was about understanding the depths of strength, the meaning of vigilance, and the power of love to guide us when the world seemed impossible. Rachel and I began to talk about the future, not in terms of fear, but possibility. What schools she wanted to attend, the friends she wanted to nurture, the places she wanted to see. I encouraged her curiosity, her intelligence, her kindness. I reminded her that she could choose her path, and that every decision she made had value and weight. And then, one quiet night, as we were finishing our tea and listening to the wind rustle the trees, I spoke in a voice both tender and firm. Remember this, Rachel, life will challenge you. Some people will try to control you, hurt you, or make you doubt your worth. But you are stronger than you know. You have learned how to see danger, how to plan, how to endure, and most importantly, how to love yourself and others in the process. She looked up at me, eyes shining, and nodded. I understand, Grandma. You must carry that knowledge forward, I said. Not as fear, but as wisdom. Protect yourself, help others when you can, and never forget that courage often starts quietly, in moments that seem small, invisible even, until you realize the difference they make. In the stillness of the night, I felt a profound sense of closure. Not that our lives would ever be perfect, or that every scar would disappear, but that we had created a space for hope, safety, and growth. That our experiences, painful as they were, had forged a bond between us stronger than fear, a bond rooted in love, understanding, and resilience. I thought about the legacy I wanted to leave, not just for Rachel, but for anyone who might hear this story someday. That survival is possible. That fear, though real, can be met with preparation and courage. That trauma shapes us, but does not have to define us. That love, steadfast, intentional, protective, has the power to transform the darkest nights into a dawn we can choose to embrace. And as Rachel drifted to sleep beside me, her breathing steady and calm, I felt the weight of years lift ever so slightly. I whispered a promise to her and to myself, we will continue, together. We will remember, we will teach, and we will live fully, carrying forward the lessons carved into our hearts by experience, endurance, and unwavering love. The house, once heavy with shadows, now held warmth. The walls seemed to breathe gently with us, no longer witnesses to fear but companions to resilience. And I, an old woman with years of memory and wisdom, could finally rest knowing that the life we had fought for, ordinary, sacred, ours, was no longer a dream but a reality.